Battlegrounds, the Lost Community of Fazendeville, is underwritten by the Miro Foundation on a continuous mission to improve the quality of life in St. Bernard Parish, nurturing a vibrant mix of culture, nature, strength, and hometown spirit. And by the Willwoods Community, rooted in prayer, united in service. Red River Bank. And the Crusto Jupiter Family Memorial Fund, the St. Bernard Tourist Commission, Liberty Bank, and Coaxum Enterprises Incorporated.
Fazanville was almost a self-sustaining community. It had its own little grocery stores. You had bars, a number of them. And in addition to that, you had recreation.
The National Cemetery was to your left. It was behind us. And the monument was in front of us. But we were in the middle.
They wanted it to kind of bring back some of the pomp and circumstance that used to be around celebrating the Battle of New Orleans.
They wanted to make way to open up that whole area, the Chalmette Battlefield, and that's what they did.
I think that Fazanville was just something that some people just didn't want to see there.
He had just built that house, and he said, I'm not leaving my house.
People were actually crying in church because they knew that they were going to have to pick up and go someplace else. There was nothing that they could do.
You know, I could never figure out what was the reason for wanting to make people move away from there, you know? It's kind of hard to buck the government, you know. They say go, you gotta go.
I've always been referred to as the Second Battle of New Orleans. You know, these people lost their battle, you know, on that same field.
It needs to be told. The story needs to be told.
I was 5 when Fazanville was no more. I didn't really realize what had happened or why. I just knew that it wasn't there anymore. I know we had folks in my neighborhood who had moved from Fazanville. Also, my babysitter was from Fazanville. We called her Aunt Julia. We always had a feeling that we were somehow connected to the village, but we didn't know the connection until other folks started doing research on the community.
And she actually signs there.
And this is at St. Louis Cathedral?
St. Louis Cathedral.
Baptism? And identified my great-great-grandfather as the founder. The community is so much more important than all of that. What they did and what they became far supersedes any importance of my relatives' part in the history of the village.
Woody Keim came to me, and it was important to him to tell the story of the residents there. We were coming up on an anniversary of the founding of Fazanville. The Park Service wanted to commemorate this in some way. And their idea was they were going to have a series of facilitated talks where they were going to bring former residents in and, you know, people who had an interest in the story of Fazanville. And then, I asked, a question, simple question. Does anybody have any pictures of this? Now, of course, the residents, they had gone through Hurricane Betsy. That wiped out a lot of photos. And then, years later, there was Hurricane Katrina. Wiped out those pictures, that might have been left. We leave the meeting and we don't, really have a line on do we have pictures or not. So 6 months later, I'm sitting in my office and the receptionist comes in and she says, someone just dropped off this disc. It's a disc that has, written on it, Fazanville pics. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. And all of a sudden, the village just comes to life. Here's a chance for us to tell it from their words and really to tell the complete story as best we can.
People who are from Fazanville pronounce it Fazanville.
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 Have you heard it pronounced any other way?
Of course.
They weren't from there. Those of us who's from there, it's always been Fazanville.
Coming from different cultures and different places, so they just pronounce it. And it's good for the Southern dialect for us to butcher up a lot of names. This is not New England. We don't care like that.
Now the street was rocks. The houses were mostly white with a lot of screen porches.
They were trimmed with either red or blue trimming around the windows, and they were very well kept. Some of them had picket fence that was painted.
Across from the houses was the field. There were pecan fields over there, a lot of pecan trees. We knew about the Battle of New Orleans, and we knew that the land that we lived on years ago was where the Battle of New Orleans was fought.
This is very young land, if we're talking geologically. Everything in southern Louisiana is. Back before, settlements, we had the Chitimacha moving through this area, using the land. And then we get to settlers coming in. Mid-1700s is when we started having plantations here. And that coincided right after the establishment of New Orleans, just up the river. After the American Revolution, we technically had our freedom, but the British still weren't really respecting our independence. The War of 1812 was essentially the Second Battle of Independence. Technically, the Battle of New Orleans happened after the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, which would have ended the war if it had already been ratified. All the signatures weren't on it yet, so the war was still raging on.
People always refer to the Battle of New Orleans as the battle that was fought after the treaty was signed. And it drives me crazy. Because, yeah, the treaty was negotiated and signed by the people that was sent to negotiate. It wasn't ratified. King didn't sign it, President didn't sign it, Senate didn't pass it.
The diversity of the people calling themselves Americans fighting to repulse the British invasion was critical. That battle redefined who constituted an American. Because when you look at the people on that battlefield, there were French speakers, Spanish speakers, the Native Americans, free people of color, enslaved Africans, all fighting.
If the British had won, everything would have changed. They would have had control over New Orleans, which would have meant they had control over the Mississippi, which would have given them an exceptional stronghold. The war might have ended very differently. It really established New Orleans as a strong port city, an important city to control. If you control New Orleans, you control the Mississippi River, which gets you a lot. This really unified the country into feeling like it was one nation, and it established it as a nation, as a global superpower to other countries in the world.
In fact, up to the Civil War, the Battle of New Orleans was celebrated throughout the country as great as July 4th.
Interest in having a monument to commemorate the battle happened almost immediately. The only trouble was that interest groups had a hard time raising the funds for it. By 1855, that's when the monument started being built. However, that was the same year that they were building the Andrew Jackson sculpture monument in Jackson Square. That one got completed, the monument did not. It was finally completed in 1908, but the actual finished design was a little bit different from what they had first imagined in the 1800s.
Of course, the backbone of the economy of St. Bernard Parish and Louisiana in the early 19th century through the Civil War had been agriculture. First it was indigo, then it was replaced by sugarcane, so that there were very large sugarcane plantations throughout St. Bernard Parish when the Civil War broke out. And then we were occupied very early on, as soon as the city of New Orleans fell, so that the plantations really ceased operation. Jean-Pierre Fazan was born to a family of free people of color, the gens de couleur, and he was part of an elite, if you will. He was very well educated, very highly read. His family had been sugar planters in the country parishes outside New Orleans. They were also business owners.
Jean-Pierre Fazan inherited the property from his father, who had inherited from his wife originally. But the property was only 1 arpent wide, which was only 200 feet from the river to the swamp. During the Civil War, many free people of color decided to leave because they weren't sure what was going to happen if the South happened to win the war. So many spent the war in Mexico until it was decided that the North had won.
During the Civil War, there was a camp where the cemetery and battlefields are now. Back then they would have called it a contraband camp. When the Union Army came and took over New Orleans in 1862, they also took over these encampments of the Confederacy, and they turned them into these refuges, a place where fleeing enslaved people could come and seek refuge. A lot of those people likely then became the residents of Fazanville. The National Cemetery was established in 1864 to be a final resting place for Union soldiers who died in the area. Prior to that, there were burials, but it wasn't really a formal national cemetery. They started moving non-veterans outside, and that included disinterments of formerly enslaved people. So there were approximately 2,000 African Americans that were removed into an adjacent cemetery called the Freedmen's Cemetery. The records weren't greatly upkept, and in a couple of years it was hard to see really any evidence of that Freedmen's Cemetery. It's unmarked. It is the land that is directly adjacent to the cemetery, near where the British flagpole currently sits today.
Just after the Civil War, Jean-Pierre took his family back to New Orleans and shortly after decided that he was going to create this community called Fazanville. He would subdivide the property and break it up into 40-foot sections and sell them to the newly emancipated slaves. And that's how Fazanville started.
Fazanville is the outgrowth of slavery. It wasn't urban slavery as we have in New Orleans. It was real slavery in the fact that it was plantations and people were freed from hard labor servitude. These are folks who were intent on being somebody. And that is what you find in families from Fazanville.
Contrary to what a lot of people believed during the Reconstruction era, a lot of the newly freed slaves were very self-sufficient right after slavery. They wanted to have property. They wanted to own land. They knew that it was important to own the land. They knew they couldn't own the land in New Orleans because it was much more expensive. So they stopped just right before you got to New Orleans and was able to purchase those properties.
The families that moved in there stayed there. You'll see some of the same families time and time again, several of them having several houses there, and they thrived.
My dad was born in 1903, and his siblings were all older than he. His mother died when he was 13. They were original residents of Fazanville.
My grandmother owned her own house, and most of the people in the village owned their own home. When they settled, they bought the property. Ownership to them was high priority.
So Fazanville was basically the proverbial dirt road. And it was like with everything else in Americana, the great Americana dirt road, where you go down Fazanville and you come to the people houses. On one side there was the houses, on the other side there was pecan groves.
It was more or less like a gated community because it was one way in, one way out. You can go and leave your door open, you had nothing to worry about.
And a lot of the people had beautiful flower gardens. I remember my grandmother, where she would get the cow manure and as her fertilizer for our garden. I said, "What is that smell?" She said, "Well, baby, if you want your flowers to grow nice and pretty, you have to put the manure on because the manure is their fertilizer." I said, "Oh."
We had roses, red, we had yellow, we had white, we had Easter lilies, violets. My mother, used to love flowers. And the whole front yard had flowers.
Them purple flowers that used to be planted in people's yards sometime on Fazanville. My mother was a flower person. Flower garden, it was her.
We had plenty of land. So my dad grew vegetables, tomatoes, mustard greens, onions, green peppers, eggplant. He also grew pigs. Every once in a while he'd kill a pig, and our job, I shudder when I think about it. He didn't make hog-head cheese, but I know they made chitlins. I can't stand those things. We had to clean them out, and chitlin is the intestines of the pig. That's what chitlins are. That's a delicacy now.
We used to hunt there. We used to pick pecan, especially after a hurricane or a storm or something. We had sacks of pecan.
We had a fireplace, and so mother would send me and my brother down by what we call it the coal tipper, the flat railroad car. And then, when they get full, some coal drip on both sides of the track. And she would send us with like a 2-gallon water bucket, to go pick up coal to put in the fireplace to keep warm too.
And you know what? I love bananas today because the boats used to stop out there and they used to give all of the people bananas off the boats.
They had so many aspects, like the church, the Benevolent Society halls, the juke joints. They had the grocery stores, the school, just about everything a small community would need. Battleground Baptist Church was, you might say, the core of the community. It was established in 1867.
No one really knows exactly where the church started. The real history only starts in Fazanville when they actually put up a structure, because before then they were just meeting outside or meeting in a tent or meeting somewhere. They built the church in Fazanville for $400.
That Battleground Baptist Church was the one that had longevity. Most of these communities, right after the Civil War, were, if they had a church, that church served almost every occasion. Of course, they didn't have the money to build all these other buildings, so the church was there as the core of the community.
I can remember when I got baptized. I was about 7 years old, and I can see so vividly today. We were walking up the village, up the road, not when the street was a road, to go to the river, and that's where we got baptized at.
Walking through the village, going to the river. I was baptized in the Mississippi River. I don't know if I was more afraid of going in the river than I was being baptized.
It was a whole ritual that they had to go through, like days before. You know, the ministers and their associates would go out and they'd map out the area in the water. They'd put the sticks down to tell you how far to go and, you know, to lean on something if you needed it. And, you know, there was sinkholes there, so it was pretty dangerous.
You know what was so strange about it is that none of the men could swim. So if they lost a kid or somebody under the water, it was interesting. They never lost a soul. But nobody could swim.
They took sheets and made a garment that was all white. Then you had a white, it wasn't a towel, it was a sheet, but it covered your head and it was tied in the back. The girls had it and the boys had it. And everybody be standing on the levee, say, amen.
And when they found out there was a baptism going on, people would come from around because they knew it was just once a year. So yeah, it was a big occasion to watch.
Whether you were saved, sanctified or not, you went to the baptism, you know, because it was just a major event in the community. They had benevolent societies. They had two, one for the men, one for the women. It came, you might say, out of the church. Of course, most of these newly formed communities, newly formed after the war, of course, did not have any insurance. And so this was their way of making sure that you could help someone if they had, you know, a fire, somebody died and couldn't bury the person. And most of them were basically burial insurance. As a matter of fact, that's how many of the Black insurance companies started. Many of them were buried in Ellen Cemetery, which is not on the Fazanville property. And Ellen was the name of the first person, Miss Ellen, that was buried there. And they named the cemetery after her.
Ellen Cemetery is owned by two benevolent associations that were in Fazanville. They paid dues. They paid $1 a month. They buried the people that were in the association for free. If you were from Fazanville or if you were a person related to somebody in Fazanville, you can be buried in Ellen.
These benevolent societies were very important in the community. And another thing that they finally built buildings for the societies. And so they would use those as community centers. As a matter of fact, they had the school in one of the benevolent societies.
One big room, it was called the hall. It was Progressive Hall.
If you can imagine a hall where you had the first graders, and the next aisle was the second graders, third graders, fourth graders, fifth, sixth, seventh, through 8. Now after the 8th grade, you could not attend school in St. Bernard Parish.
I started school in Fazanville in the one-room schoolhouse. I was there every Sunday. We played there simply because when I was born in 1943, there was no mixing of races.
Well, I went from first prima grade to 3rd grade. Then after that, they built the one school line in Violet called Violet consolidated colored school. And everybody in the parish that was black went to that one school. The older people say, boy, you better go and get you a good education, you know.
My grandmother was like the oldest of about 10 children, and she had 8 children. They worked in the field, you know, very hard labor. She said, these children have to go to school.
That was one thing we must do. You will get an education. We had to go to school. We had to go to college, and I did. There was a bar next to our house, and the music was so loud until the neighbors and all the people down the street came to our yard, and we used to dance in our yard until about 10, 11 o'clock, and then everybody went inside and went home.
They had the clubs, the juke joints, and then they had the big dances in the Benevolent Society halls. Fats Domino was one of the performers from New Orleans that would come over.
Fats Domino came in the hall. He would come there at night in the evening when they would have fish fries and all. You know, to be out. Him and my uncle, you know, to be out socializing, drinking, you know, like that. He had a piano in the hall, and he'd play on it a little bit and sing. But he wasn't really that famous at that time. He wasn't famous at all at that time.
The 30th of May, Declaration Day as they call it, was very important. It was, you know, patriotic, and many of those men had fought in the war. And then there were also blacks that they knew that had fought in the Civil War. They had a sense of pride, and they had a sense of patriotism. So it was their day too.
They would have a ceremony in the cemetery, and we, as kids, when we hear the music start playing, the band, it was a military band used to go through that. We would run across the cow pasture, the field, and get on the cemetery wall and watch the ceremony, you know. Because when kids hear music, you know, you get all excited, you know. And we had to go run. We knew what was going on. Later that day, they would have a baseball game on Memorial Day, that Monday. And there's some men was a good baseball player because the town had a baseball team, you know. Fazanville Sports, that was the name of it.
There were various leagues where you played baseball against another team as far away as Lucy and Agard.
They played other teams from city and further down in St. Bernard. We would play baseball up there and sit out there and watch the game.
It was in the pasture land. It was on that government property, but that's where the baseball park was on that. And a lot of times, if you hit a ball back where the pecan trees was, the way they had the park situated, that would be a home run.
The Chalmette Monument was, if you go in the village, was to your right. We used to go over there into the monument, and we would walk up those stairs and look out the window and look at the river and look all around St. Bernard Parish.
We used to play in there as kids all the time, and run all the way up the steps to the top. Then we would run down.
The Park Service started accumulating pieces of the battlefield, of the cemetery. You had the Kaiser Aluminum Corporation that owned the other half of the battlefield between Fazanville and the cemetery. In the 50s, another significant event occurs. St. Bernard Parish was getting in trouble with the city of New Orleans for dumping waste into the Mississippi River. So the parish agreed to build a wastewater treatment center. They had any number of miles of riverfront to do this, and they chose directly in front of the Fazanville community.
Oh God, that was horrible. The stench from that, I mean, ugh. That was terrible when they did that. Nobody asked anybody's permission. They just built the sewage plant. Oh, do I remember that? Oh my God, that used to stink. And believe me, it could have been the reason why we had to leave. That they wanted to build that sewage plant and that they wanted this land for government's sake.
We then get into the 1960s, and now we're really at the height of the civil rights movement. And the park is getting ready to celebrate the sesquicentennial of the Battle of New Orleans, which is the 150th anniversary of the battle. A lot of people wanted this to be a big deal. They wanted it to kind of bring back some of the pomp and circumstance that used to be around celebrating the Battle of New Orleans. And the superintendent at the time knew at this point that the only thing standing in the way is Fazanville.
In Fazanville, when they started the movement to get them out of that area, many of the residents, they heard what they told them. They said, well, we're expanding the park. We're gonna have this big celebration. But some of them thought, well, I think it's more than that.
There had been rumors that they were going to buy Fazanville. Probably for years, I had heard the rumors. A part of the rumor was that integration was coming to St. Bernard Parish and to the South, and that the children in Fazanville were the closest ones to Araby and to Chalmette, and they did not want those children to be integrated with white kids. Now that was the rumor. What actually happened was evidently there was a powerful woman who wanted to combine the cemetery and the monument.
So what happened was, you're coming out to 150th anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans. And there was a woman by the name of Martha Robinson. She was a socialite in New Orleans who was heavily involved in the League of Women Voters, so she was very much of an activist.
Just to give you an example of Martha, she worked against child labor, and she was also one of the great leaders in the crusade to stop the Riverfront Expressway from compromising the French Quarter. Martha Robinson was very keenly aware of the crusade over decades to save at least part of the Chalmette Battlefield site. Knowing that Henry Kaiser owned the majority of the land between the monument tract and the Chalmette National Cemetery, she called Russell Long, Senator Russell Long, and he arranged for the legislation to be introduced in Congress which authorized the acquisition of that Kaiser tract.
They had to make it a big event. That was the intention, to make the 150th a big event. So she got the railroad and she got Kaiser Aluminum to donate this corporate property in between that was unused and make it one thing. Just this little neighborhood was kind of an inconvenience in a way. A speed bump in the process. Of course, that speed bump was a community of wonderful people, 33 families.
So we end up with a park with a neighborhood in the middle of it. And at that point, Fazanville is looking like an anachronism, something out of its time. You have the park trying to tell the story of a battle, of a cemetery, and then in the middle of all that, you have a neighborhood that has been there for about 100 years with their own stories to tell. And they're two very different stories, and that's really kind of where the conflict starts happening. In 1960s Louisiana, people of color didn't have a lot of rights. Their history was not yet thought of as something worth preserving. And so for the sake of the sesquicentennial, there was pressure and eventual success to buy out the land of Fazanville and push the residents out of the area so that the village could be bulldozed. When Congress first authorized the park to start negotiating with the residents, the Park Service brought an appraiser in to try and figure the value of the homes and of the property.
They painted the picture to people that the houses were raggedy, but that was a lie. If they were not, they were very nice houses.
Some of them had beautiful homes. And we had like a 10-room home. And then my dad had 2 more rooms on the side. So it was beautiful. It was wonderful.
They basically had painted Fazanville as just a little shanty town. And so therefore removing this was just like removing vestiges of the shanties of slavery.
The money that they did give you, it wasn't worth it. They hardly gave you any money for your homes, hardly anything.
I remember my dad talking about it. In fact, I remember him just really being very, very, very emotional about it. And he wrote a letter to the President of the United States and to the Department of the Interior complaining about the mere pittance that they were giving the residents who lived in Fazanville for their land. But it did no good, you know.
So the average payout to the property owners was a little over $4,000 a piece. And just to give you kind of a comparison, the average property value in St. Bernard Parish in Chalmette was almost $19,000. So property values alone, housing condition notwithstanding, were worth a lot more than the residents ended up being paid.
The residents actually fought it. I mean, it wasn't that you just move us out and you don't have no resistance. Yes, they hired lawyers. As a matter of fact, AP Turo was one of them. And there were several others that they hired to help them. And, you know, they had this whole letter writing campaign in various instances. And finally, you know, they just told them that it's just difficult to fight the government.
Finally, one Sunday in church, Reverend Gant, who was a pastor then, announced that it was really going to happen, that we had to look at finding property because it's really going to happen. We're going to have to move. And so that was a sad Sunday when that was announced. Many of those people had been there since 1867. Their ancestors had been there all that time.
The whole neighborhood was worried about where they're gonna go. We had no idea what we were gonna do.
Most of the residents, most of the property owners settled, but there were 3 holdouts who did not want to move.
But Peter Pierre's family was one of the last ones to leave. My dad finally went out there and said, Frances, that was his sister, you're going to have to move. You have to get out. Because he said, you can't stay here any longer.
And I remember my dad and I were the last 2 to move out because my daddy said, I'm not letting them take my land from me. And he was very adamant about that, but he had no choice. Eventually, we left.
Who pays attention to people who don't have money? If you don't have money to fight, what can you do about it?
You know, they were just in the way. It was just one of those situations that went through Congress back then. You know, you didn't have the type of attention to personal rights that you do nowadays. So it was just one of those situations where, you know, the powers, and these were significantly powerful people. You don't mess with F.A. Hebert, you know, Hale Boggs. These were the leaders of the House and the Senate. If they wanted something, they got it. Jack Kennedy actually signed the documents for expropriation a month before he died.
Eminent domain was approved to forcibly remove those residents from the community. And by 1964, everything was bulldozed, which is ironic since that's the same year that the Civil Rights Act was passed.
Some people questioned if he actually knew that people actually lived there. Some people say he never knew that that was a community.
And I found out that President Kennedy had signed it. I said, oh, so that's why we got kicked out. That's why we got kicked out, because they told him that it was shanty houses. And he didn't take the time to come down here to see whether or not they were shanty houses or whether or not he was putting innocent people, loving people, family people out of their homes. So he went on and signed the bill. I guess you know how government is. They do what they want to do.
The Declaration of Taking, that's what the government called the documents that they gave to the residents. Declaration of Taking.
Obliterate is a fairly appropriate word. It was literally obliterated from the landscape. The residents were forced to move, whether just under pressure, under passive-aggressive wastewater treatment plants, and then eventually through eminent domain, these residents were uprooted from their community. And after that, the village was bulldozed. So it was literally obliterated from the landscape.
My parents moved out of Fazanville. I was in the military. And when I got home, they was in the lower Ninth Ward.
I was in the service during the Vietnam era, and all this took place while I was away. And when I came back, that was very disturbing to me. And I still cannot comprehend why that was did to, but I know why. Because of the premise, because of this integration, and they didn't want to integrate the schools, and they didn't want the black kids to go there in the first place. Let's be for real.
One family was coming in from California to try to take care of their goods in their home when they got in a terrible automobile accident, and they never got there, so their house was bulldozed.
Mr. Minor actually broke his neck, but he still lived. And you know, he was hospitalized for a very long time, and they went back to California. But even with his challenged physical condition, he was still writing letters to lawyers and judges and back and forth, you know, trying to deal with the situation. But of course, it was no avail.
They had the right to move their homes if they chose, some did. And as a consequence, you know, they were just, as a diaspora, they were just spread out.
We didn't have to move a whole lot of things. Everything just stayed in the house, and he moved the house. He said all they're gonna do is set the house on the foundation, and he'll finish the rest.
Oh, wow, we just cried. We cried because we just didn't know which way to go, and we had boxes that my father used to bring home because he knew that we needed boxes to put our clothes in and our shoes and our books. We couldn't leave our books. Daddy had a truck. We just had to put things in the truck and get in the back of the truck. He took about 4 trips to move everything. It just was a sad situation when we had to leave Fazanville. The village was destroyed. I don't know how they destroyed it, but once we left, we just didn't look back. So they give them what they thought they should have, and you make it the best way you can. And my daddy was a very proud man, and that's what he did. did the best he could. They made it. You know, black people are very resilient. They made it.
Again, they wanted to own the land. They didn't want to rent. 2 or 3 neighbors would get together and build a house for this one, and they build the church in the Ninth Ward on Flood Street, ironically. And then in '65, Hurricane Betsy happens.
Be advised that extremely dangerous Betsy is headed toward New Orleans. Clear its flight.
1 year later, after all of the headache of moving and having to, watch the other church be demolished, finally getting into this church, and then within a year to have the church destroyed, we were determined that we were going to rebuild the church, and we did.
I have friends from all over the country, and a lot of times when we get together, they say they're going back home. I can't say that because my home was taken away from me. And believe it or not, I have not been in the area where Fazanville is located today because of that reason. It still cuts to the coals of my heart.
The people who live there still feel like they shouldn't have just put us out like we were nothing.
That's a very important chapter, not only in their history, but in St. Bernard's history, in many ways in national history, because we have a tendency to be so focused on moving forward, we don't think of the implications of what we do sometimes. We have to do that. You have to be more conscious.
I didn't think it was fair, and I still don't think it's fair, because they lied and they have not done a thing with that land. And they were told that they were going to bring the 2 places together and build no, they haven't done anything.
Because really and truly, they didn't do anything with the land. It was weedy for a long time.
Somebody had mentioned that. Well, it says, if they'd have put something up there, I might have felt better about it. And it says, they just knocked everything down.
What many of the residents didn't understand was the concept of a national park. They were looking at a park as a place where you go and have fun and you have all the trees and you have your picnics and you enjoy it. But when they took their land and cleared off all the buildings, they also cut down the pecan trees. They cut down the grove. And that was really puzzling. So how do you cut down trees in a park? Why do you do that?
We definitely like to think that the park attitude is different today. We have the advantage of hindsight. We can look back and judge the decisions that were made and the actions that were taken. And we can understand the trauma that was caused over generations because of those decisions. Today, we try and recognize all stories equally, from the Native Americans who used to use this land to the Fazanville residents who were living through trying times, to today, for the tourists and the joggers who use the land and the locals who can enjoy it. We have a portable exhibit that was developed with Loyola University, which is a portable model of Fazanville. And so we can lay that out and people can sort of visualize what that looked like and that it was an actual community. It wasn't just a few random houses scattered throughout the battlefield. It was an established village. Our next exhibit plan will likely include a more permanent exhibit about Fazanville. In the meantime, it's about preserving the memory and making sure that we're inclusive of all of the stories that we talk about.
Honestly, I don't know what the final legacy of Fazanville is. I think that is still being written, but I think that there is a legacy that is important that we need to let people know about.
What is the evidence? My picture over there on the wall. Me. those of us who are still alive and living, because you can't go there and find anything on the ground that represented your home, that represented the place where you used to play. I'm not trying to paint the picture of Fazanville as being perfect people, but for the most part, they were genuine people. They were people who loved each other. They were people who did not mind working. They were people who loved being educated, educating their children, looking out for each other.
The legacy is the families, the people who have accomplished, the strength. Be prideful and be proud of these people. Don't live inside of the misery of what happened to them, because you're not going to be proud of them if you're living inside of the misery. I was taught not to live with that. That is the great American Black secret. Don't live with their hatred. That's the truth. That has always been how we overcame.
So many communities, like our community in Fazanville, they're lost, they're gone. You never heard of them anymore. And you never even heard of the people who actually came from them. But somebody have to have that will to want the legacy of a place like Fazanville to live on.
All of those young men went to service, every one of them. I now am in charge of the cemetery. We bury only descendants of people that are there. There are people who were born in slavery who are buried there. We more or less will exist on donations until all of the people in my generation are gone.
Like any community, they had gardens, beautiful gardens of a hybrid iris, which is a hybrid between the giant blue iris and the copper iris, which are the native irises to Louisiana. And you get this really rich purple colored iris. So the irises are kind of the last remaining pieces of Fazanville that we can still see today. And it's interesting because we didn't even know that they still existed until about 2 years ago. The COVID-19 pandemic messed up our mowing schedule, and the irises had a chance to bloom for the first time in a very long time.
I had to go down there and look at them to see how close it was to Fazanville. Right there. Right there.
You know, it's one of those things where you remember that we still have history to discover, and, you know, we still have ways to connect to the past, even if it's not really a way that we thought about before.
I find it ironic that the irises spring up now, and they probably will spring up every year in defiance of everyone who thought that the village should be dead. So they will always be a defiant remnant of Fazanville there in the middle of the battlefield.
But there is a spot over there that says Fazanville. And boy, when they put that name there, I remember right over the tracks, Fazanville.
Battlegrounds, the Lost Community of Fazendeville is underwritten by the Miro Foundation on a continuous mission to improve the quality of life in St. Bernard Parish, nurturing a vibrant mix of culture, nature, strength, and hometown spirit. And by the Willwoods Community, rooted in prayer, united in service. Red River Bank. And the Crusto Jupiter Family Memorial Fund, the St. Bernard Tourist Commission, Liberty Bank, and Coaxum Enterprises Incorporated.